Hey guys, hope you're well. As I promised, we have part 2 for you in the restraining order case of former or current Scientology security guard Jayden Wheeler versus DOA. As I expressed to you before, the entire court case essentially revolves around 3 separate incidents. So there were 3 separate events of interactions that DOA had with Jayden Wheeler that sort of serves as the basis of the TRO. And I explained to you the beginning of everything that happened. There's going to be a lot of quotes, a lot of meat to chew on. So I'm going to give you the crux of part 2 and then give you the quotes directly from the horse's mouth and then kind of analyze it. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but I'm going to give you the highlights, the bullet points as part of the initial rundown and then get into the exact tangible quotes. And again, guys, if you like what I'm doing, I got it PayPal, Venmo, all that jazz. If you want to support me getting some crappy motels for continuous court cases, because there's one happening with Daniel as well as Josiah, and obviously one in the future for DOA. So I'll start by saying no resolution, unsurprisingly, for DOA. This is going to be a marathon of a case, just like Streets LA. It's similar. No, you don't have 2 opposing teams. DOA is representing himself. But boy, that guy came in with skill and acted as if he were a lawyer with a top-notch law school degree. So certainly DOA is in very good hands, and those are his own hands, which that's really all he kind of needs. Biggest highlight that I want to start with before I forget, very exciting news. On the stand, Jayden Wheeler admitted that as an employee, as a Sea Org member for Scientology, of which he admitted he was a member of Scientology, that he got paid $50 a week. DOA got him to admit that publicly. It's in the record, publicly on the stand. So if there's any Sea Org members saying it is completely mythical that we get these slave-like wages, these exploitative wages, well, it's been officially admitted under oath that $50 a week. Of course, Mr. Wheeler tries to combat that by saying he gets free housing, which is great, and free food, and therefore it all balances out. I don't think so, but that's the essential argument that was being made. And speaking of home, it's fascinating because a lot of this cycles back to, or Kendrick Moxon is trying to say, this is all particularly worse. These interactions with Jayden Wheeler are worse because DOA has technically harassed Jayden Wheeler at his home. Remember, Jayden Wheeler lives where he works. Now, that's not the usual situation with most occupations, and I think the judge will probably think that's a little strange and not necessarily feel like, at the end of the day, Jayden Wheeler was being harassed at his home if Scott was engaging in protest activities and it was a normal public space where people would protest at that location. But that was a big claim that Scott kept showing up to his home, near his home, as if, just, you know, I think Moxon was hoping the judge didn't know the logistics that well of the Scientology building and could essentially create this tale that maybe there was even some distance from where Jayden lived to where he had the interactions with DOA, and that DOA had a consistent pattern of following him, quote-unquote, home. Of course, when you open the pickle jar, what you realize is home is on that same location. So it's a stretch of an argument, to say the least. Last time I said we had some encouraging news because it's pretty clear that Kendrick Moxon took out about 40 seconds of a video that he was supposed to submit of one of DOA's live streams as evidence. There's a lot of back and forth, and that was discussed in part 1. Would the video evidence even be admissible? The judge even said she was inclined to not really admit that. Well, the bad news is that the judge, upon Kendrick Moxon trying to make his defense, the judge said that the video, that evidence in that video from DOA's live stream would actually be admissible, and not only that, but Kendrick Moxon would not have to be on the stand. However, she said, with the points that DOA is making, somebody say hello to me, with the points that DOA is making, the weight of the video may be significantly less heavy. Like, she might not take in really much at all of the video's content into the account of her ruling. The judge sort of implied that. The judge kind of said, go ahead, go forth, but she also implied that a lot of the video would have less weight and be sort of a moot point. She did not directly say that, but she certainly indicated that. So I would say that was kind of a wash at the end of the day. Other fact witnesses. The winnowing of the witnesses. It's getting smaller and smaller, guys. Tori was nixed because she wasn't directly involved in the video, so she was supposed to be a witness. If I'm not mistaken, I think Daniel was also mixed. And there was a guy named Gonzalez. I get Daniel's last name is either Velasquez or Gonzalez, so I get the two Hispanic-sounding last names confused, but there was a Hispanic name that Kendrick Moxon wanted to put on that would essentially detest or create drawback to Scott's character and try to denigrate his character. He would have essentially been a character witness, and he was described by Moxon as one of DOA's former superiors. Again, the judge says that was not relevant to the case. I should say Scott had, and we'll talk about this when we actually read the tangible quotes, but Scott had objection after objection, most of which, 5 out of 6 objections were sustained. Most of the objections the judge responded to is when Moxon started asking Jayden Wheeler about the character of Scott. Was he drinking, for example? Did he seem intoxicated? Does he have a general pattern of being intoxicated? The judge kind of said that was irrelevant. And then another video was shown of Scott, I believe in his protesting days in West Virginia or something, and it showed him to be perhaps unhinged in that moment, and that apparently scared Jayden, and they're going to try to continue that line of questioning, and the judge immediately sustained DOA's objection about that. So they're trying to, again, they have nothing really that tangible in terms of the small window as to what actually happened in LRH Way. So they're trying to broaden the scope of what they could question DOA about and what they can make the judge feel sympathetic towards Jaylen about. The more they reveal about DOA's supposed bad character, the better they have a shot in court, especially because the 3 incidents don't actually reveal awful character, in my opinion. So the judge seems to be not having it. It's the same old Scientology tricks. It's kind of like if A equals B, then C equals D equals E equals G. It's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. It was the same stuff in the Streets LA case, right? The fact that Mr. Eckers was called Joey instead of Rockets, or Mr. Eckers, that was apparently egregious. The fact that Joey was called a straw man and not referred to as a man was offensive according to the attorney. So they try to really look at every single quote and every single aspect of what everybody has said, and of course, again, try to use that against them. But it was certainly not successful. The rest of the trial will be in mid-September, so I'll certainly be there for that. So we will have we'll start with the back and forth about the evidence. And the judge asked about the importance of this, and Kendrick Moxon says to the judge, "I don't have info in my declaration. That's my statement. I merely had videos downloaded by a paralegal. I see no utility to me testifying." The judge asks, "Are the videos of DOA speaking?" And Moxon says, "I researched authenticity. The evidence is sufficient to sustain a finding. I looked at a case about admissible photographs of evidence, for example, and it says the general principle of evidence not authenticated. Only eyewitnesses and circumstantial evidence can authenticate such photos." And then the judge says the court will allow the petitioner to introduce this evidence, but it may have less weight. You'll still have the right, DOA, she's saying, or Mr. Hotsetter, but I'll just say DOA for my sake, to negate that evidence. It is admissible, but one witness was not an eyewitness, but he's a character witness. So the testimony of I think of Mr. Gonzalez or Mr. Velasquez, I get them confused, is not admissible. So remember, I just mentioned that there could have been this character witness. This is the judge directly speaking on that in her exact quotes. And Moxon said, this man, this potential witness, is a superior of Scott. And the judge says, so we're not going to hear from that witness. So we'll go a little forward. Then this is a lot more back and forth about the witnesses. And now the official trial. And now there's more conversation about the witnesses. This is about Danny. And Moxon says, I object to Danny potentially being a witness. That is Mr. Gonzalez. So the other one was the one with the V. Mr. Gonzalez wants to provide a hearsay statement, but he wasn't there. And the judge says, I'm just going to change Gonzalez to Danny because I know it's Danny. She says, was Danny ever an eyewitness? And what do you expect him to testify about? And then Scott says, well, he could corroborate some key evidence. And the judge threw that out. So again, sorry for the disorganization, guys. There's so much here. Okay, so now the questioning begins, and this is kind of where some more stuff begins. Moxon is questioning Jayden Wheeler first, so we'll start there. And he says, where do you work? And Jayden says, I work at the Church of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard Way. And he says, what's your job? And Jayden Wheeler says, this is a fascinating terminology for a job. And this is how they circumvent actually paying a full wage, because this is fascinating what Jay says. Jay says in response to what is your job, he says, I'm a safety inspector intern. So remember, he said intern, so maybe you're free from getting a full wage. Look at that. Isn't that fun? I inspect the area to make sure there aren't dangerous things, like loose rocks or graffiti, for example. Moxon says, so you're not a licensed security guard. Jay says, no. Moxon says, so you work events. And then Jay says, yes, and I live on campus on an apartment building, because he was also asked where he lives. I make sure to look and help people park, and sometimes I use a bike and parole the area. And it says, do you recall first noticing Scott? And Moxon says, and Jay says, I noticed the first time I saw him, I noticed he was wearing weird clothing and acting erratically and was barking at a dog of someone I know who passes by. So Jay has claimed in a lot of his statements that LRH Way is sort of the safe space for the kind neighbors to walk their dogs. And they like to use LRH Way because it's a more low-key, safe space to walk dogs. And apparently this guy with the dog, the guy in question, he was a regular walker of this dog who felt safe walking his little poodle in the LRH area. And that's kind of what all started it, interestingly enough. So Jay's saying he knows the guy. Moxon said, and it didn't look like a protest at this specific event, did it? When you saw Scott, did it appear that he was under the influence? And Jay says, yes, it looks like he was smoking and drinking. And Moxon said, did he drive after drinking? And Jay says, it appears that he did so. So again, that's them trying to say that Scott isn't drunk and that he's violent. Then there's a video of Scott saying, I'm so fucking high. And then Scott says, I object. What's the relevance? And then the judge sustains that objection. Moxon was trying to retort, saying, well, this is an example of the stress and the harassment that's been caused and what's been fueling the behavior of DOA. And she didn't really buy that much at all. She said, objection sustained. I want to focus on the particular events of the TRO. So remember, instead of Jay saying, this is what Scott said to me, this is what Scott did to me, this is how Scott made me feel unsafe, which he later does say, he starts with saying this was the precondition of Scott before he showed up, which isn't relevant really to the case. Whether you're drunk or high, you know, you can be high and be the kindest person in the world. You can be hammered, and that's me. When I'm hammered, I'm a very happy drunk. There are a lot of very happy, kind drunks. So a lot of that is irrelevant, and it's just kind of an effort to assassinate DOA's character. So that was thrown off. And then Moxon said, well, let's talk about that specific night again. You heard barking. Jay said, yes, I heard that. I was confused and worried for the safety of the dog walker that I know. Scott ran toward him and yelled at me. He was acting erratically. Moxon said, did Scott approach you later concerning the incident? And Jay says he did. He was shouting obscenities when I was riding my bike. And that I should have saved him. And yet I rode in the other direction. So Scott was sort of taunting Jayden Wheeler, saying he should have saved him from the dog. And then Moxon says, what did you see Scott do in LRH Way? Jay said, Scott was yelling at anybody who comes by. People walking their dogs said he was disturbing them and that they were growing to fear him. Moxon said this was the Easter incident on March 31st. Moxon then says, tell us about the Easter incident on March 31st. Jay says, well, we have this kids event I was working on helping setting it up. And Moxon said there was a formal closing of the street, if I'm not mistaken. Jay says, yes, I helped vendors in and out. I was at the event, kids were there. I told Scott he was not invited and he was trespassing. He got aggressive, saying, I dare you to move me. I took it as a violent threat. Remember, this is all Jay talking. Knowing Scott, if I responded in any way, it would end in violence. So here's the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon stuff yet again. What Jay is going to try to continue to claim here consistently is that even though Scott never said, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to beat you up, I'm going to raise my finger at you, he never raised a fist, nothing like that. The fact that Scott dared Jay to move him, and the fact that Scott is 200 plus pounds and taller than Jay, is a threat of violence, because he is so erratic acting and he's so drunk and high that if Jay tried to move him, it would end in violence. Therefore, this is real stretch of the imagination, guys, DOA is making a violent threat by saying to Jay, I dare you to move me. Talk about a stretch if there ever was one in my mind. So we'll continue on this. So Moxon says to Jay, so you saw violent videos of Scott. You saw videos of Scott being violent. And Jay says, yes, I saw a video where Scott knocked a man off his bike. And this is a separate video, again, of Scott's protesting days. And yet again, Scott objects. Relevancy, and the judge says sustained. Moxon said, okay, well, did the video you saw to make you worried he'd be violent? And again, DOA objects, judge sustains the objection. And so there's another question is asked, and Jay's asked to kind of continue giving his rundown. And Jay says, Scott challenged me in a very aggressive tone. I moved away to make space so I wouldn't be hurt. I didn't stay. I gave him the same warnings of trespassing that I had previously, and he did not follow it. He said, I dare you to move me. Moxon says to Jay, later you are in LRH Way removing the signs, and Scott approached you, yes? Jay says, Scott drove up to me and said, fuck you. I rode away, he followed. I stopped, he stopped. He called me a bitch. He rode up to LRH Way. I rode up to LRH Way to get away. It's hard not to laugh when he's directly quoting all that stuff. Oh, and we'll talk about this again further in the testimony, but apparently Jay being called a bitch is a homophobic slur and is anti-gay, which is a whole new one to me. Moxon says to Jay, why did you try to get away? Jay says, I couldn't go into the street as Scott was driving a car at the moment. So Moxon said, let's go to May 31st. Side note, guys, May 31st, this is the day before the occupation. So remember, all these people got threats of protesting a myriad of hours, 2, 3, 4 hours, before the 11 a.m. permit the next day actually took into effect. So just keep that in mind when I continue reading this. Moxon says, was there a closing permit? So remember, this is a big battle of a permit. Jay says, yes. I first saw Scott at LRH Way. He said he was coming up to a closed part of the street and that he would be back. He came back with his van, drove fast up to LRH Way. Right before he got to me, he slammed his brakes. I was terrified. He stopped, revved his engine, and said he was going to drive me out of the street. He was yelling, I'm going to come up the street. Other people started yelling about permits. He then parked his van, walks up to the street. I told him we have a street closure, and he again says, I dare you to fucking touch me. He was very threatening. All direct quotes from Jay. Isn't that fun? And Moxon shows this video. Scott objects, saying there's 40%. There are 40 seconds taken out of this video. The judge says overruled, but you could address that when you testify. Meaning the judge's like, I'm probably going to give you credit once you say it's bullshit, but you're just going to have to wait to testify. And DOA is quoted saying, eat a cock. Call the cops. Please don't touch. You have no authority. Come on, I dare you to fucking touch me. Touch me. You punk ass little bitch. What are you like, 12? I wonder why they call you bitch. I can't help but laugh. But he's not using the FA word against Jayden or saying he's gay or using any sort of gay slur, but they're trying to play that little clip of the video to indicate as such. Moxon says, when Scott calls you a bitch, what effect did it have? And Jay says to Moxon, he mentions my age and sexuality. He never did, but that's what Jay says. He mentions my age, says Jay, and sexuality, which made me feel very uncomfortable. It made me feel scared. Questioning me about my sexuality. That's gross, and it's painful to relive that moment. Moxon says, in this video, it shows your face close up. And Jay says, yes, it was a scary interaction. And Moxon says, exact words, why are you be frightened by this incident of him calling you a little bitch? And Jay says, the fact that he was willing to drive quickly up the street, driving at 10 miles an hour, and then says he's going to drive through me, and he's 100 pounds heavier than me, he's taller than me, and I don't fight, he would have hurt me for sure. It was terrifying. I've had trouble sleeping, as he could come to my home at any time. I've sought to avoid him after this incident. Moxon says, any other acts? A couple, like when he battered a man on his bike and pepper sprayed somebody. Objection, relevance, sustained. Meaning, Jay was like, other incidents scare me that I have nothing to do with. Jay referring to these protesting clips of Scott maybe from a year ago, a year and a half ago. And Jay's trying to bring that up. Jay's trying to say these are the incidents that scare me because it constitutes something about his character, even though nothing was directed at me. Scott objects to it. Surprise, surprise. The judge is like, come on. Sustains. She sustains the objective. God, by the way, sustain means objection successful. Jay says, I've tried to work at different church properties. That seems like a tall claim, but I still live there. I went to the police after this, and they told me to get a restraining order, a temporary restraining order. Moxon said, do you see a video of Scott and his restraining order reaction? And there's a video from Aja's stream about Scott reacting, and they show that video. The judge asked Jay, wait, so were you there when DOA got a TRO? Jay says yes. DOA was on LRH Way, running from the north to the south side. He dropped food and is trying to evade getting served the TRO. And Scott actually notes that Jayden wasn't there, scene being he heard, and that objection is sustained. Moxon says, did you see the incident? Jay says, no, I saw the, well, he didn't say no, he just said, I saw the video. And, again, these are the quotes of 86 GOP. He comes back with a vengeance. 86 GOP says, I'm going to kill Moxon's wife and burn down the Church of Scientology. That's a very serious thing to say, because you're trying to get protection. This person is giving him money, says he's going to kill somebody. That made me scared. Judge was like, wait, you saw this? Scott said this? Mr. Hotsetter said this? Jay said, no. It was a donor who raised my fear. Prior, there was no mention of murder or arson. Since then, I don't know what to do. Meaning DOA 86 GOP coming back with a vengeance. All those threats made Jay incredibly scared for his safety. And it was great that the judge had the conniption to go out of her way to clarify that, because obviously she's a lot less impressed that this is a telephone game. This essentially, surprise, surprise, turns into a game of guilt by association, all being pinned on 86 GOP. And now it's time for Scott to ask Mr. Wheeler the questions that he wants to ask. This is the big $50 a week. Scott says, are you a Church of Scientology member? You get paid how much a week? This is a big moment. Jay says $50 a week, in addition to housing and food. And then Scott tries to say, your leader, LRH, said about lawsuits, an objection is raised by Moxon, saying this has nothing to do with the case, and the judge sustains Moxon's objection. So, there's a lot of the way the Church of Scientology practice. Remember, like with all of these cases, with either of them, there's going to be so much that you want to use that you can't use. And you have to keep things incredibly narrow. And that's what kind of everybody forgets. Or everybody tries their own Hail Marys. But, you had to stay focused on the narrow aspects of the case. So talking about LRH and what he's written, good try, but objection overruled. Scott says on January 29th, there was an incident with a man and a poodle. You allege I kicked rocks at the poodle. Jay says yes. Scott says, and you observed this directly? Jay says, yes. Scott says, do you have access to cameras in the area? Jay says yes. Scott then says, so on LRH, these cameras are recording from the roof. Jay says yes. Scott says, did you or Poodle Man file the police report? Jay says no. So very smart of Scott to bring this up. What Scott is essentially saying is there's all this material caught on tape 24/7 all the time by the security cameras of the Church of Scientology. They didn't want to use the security cameras. They, for some reason, did not want to use the security cameras at all whatsoever. Probably because they actually showed the material that was on the cameras, it would exonerate Scott. But Scott really was able to trip them up, successfully saying, are you aware of all these cameras in the Church of Scientology? Yes. Aren't they filming from all these different vantage points? Yes. Yet none of that was used. It's only Scott's video directly being used. So that was an interesting contrast that Scott was able to make. And then also remarked that after these incidents, if the issue was so traumatic, then a police report would be filed immediately, yet it was filed a handful of days after. So Jay noted that how much later it was filed. So Scott says, and on June 1st, you say I stalked you. What time? Jay says, in the morning. Scott says, do you have video of that incident? Jay says, not that I know of. Scott says, what was the start of the time of the pursuit? Jay says, I think 11. Scott says, what time did you tell me I was trespassing? Jay says, sometime in the morning. Scott says, before or after 11 a.m. Jay pauses for a solid, I wrote this down, 9 seconds. He just pauses and he says, I don't remember. Meaning Jay just shot himself in the foot. Remember, they're trying to say Scott was trespassing. Now they're talking about the video in question. Well, they're saying Scott was trespassing, and Jay confirms that all of this is in the morning before 11 a.m., where he actually could be cited for trespassing when the permit was in effect, but this was a multitude of hours before 11 a.m., before the permit went into effect. Therefore, Scott would not be considered trespassing by that explanation. So then Scott says, can the public get into the Easter event? Jay says, yes. Did you ever ask me if I had a ticket? Scott says. Jay said, no. Scott says, during the event, were others walking using the sidewalk? Jay says, yes. Scott says, but you didn't trespass them. And did you call the police to issue them a trespass warning? And Jay said no, so he makes a point with that. Scott says, did you specifically tell me I was trespassing when I got onto a sidewalk? Jay says no. And Scott says, do you see others with signs and costumes? Jay says, I don't recall. I know people were with you. Meaning, Scott's getting him to confirm that he was in the act of protesting, infringing on his rights. Scott says, you didn't see the barbecue. This is during the occupation. The barbecue and the food outside. Jay says, no. Scott says, did you see my van? Jay says, yes. Because remember, Scott's van is a focal point of all of this, right? He aggressively used his van at 10 miles an hour to try to potentially run over Jay. And Jay says, yes. And Scott says, do you see a Church of Scientology suck sticker on it? He said, yes. Meaning that this van was a van of protest. It had signage indicating that it was protesting against the Church of Scientology. And it is, again, another bit of evidence that Scott was engaged in the continuous act of protesting consistently. And Scott says, after the poodle incident, did you fear for your life? Jay said, not yet, but I felt fearful. Scott said, did you fear for your safety? Jay said, not yet. And then finally, he continues in line of questions. Scott said, at any time did I ever threaten to beat you up? Jay says, you demanded I move, which you know would lead to that. Scott says, did you follow me? Jay said, I followed you after you were trespassing. So there you go. Jay just admits he was following Scott. Whoops. Did I push you? Scott asked. Jay says, no. But I was moving backwards out of fear that you would hurt me. Scott says, any other security guards say I was trespassing? Jay says, I don't know. And then they had to break for lunch, and we'll get the rest of the conclusion later on. So forgive me for the mix-up of Guillermo from The Tonight Show. Definitely that's not who it was, but now you have the Gonzalez and Valleja names. We'll try to get that more hollowed out. And minor criticism that a few people had. Some people thought I was too nice about my analysis with Tao. I called Tao smart. I'm not backing away from that, guys. I don't agree with Tao. I'm on Aja's side. At the end of the day, Tao knew this court system. He was intelligent. Do I think Tao's a good person? No. Do I think he has acted honestly? No. Do I think he's deceptive? Yes. But do I think he's an intelligent person? Yes. And do I think he knows the way that court works and is smart? Yeah. So you got to give credit if somebody is able to maneuver the legal system successfully. Because remember, guys, I'm on the side of the protesters, but in addition, there's the people who report the news, and they're literally almost stenographers, right? It's like what I just read. And there are other people who analyze the news and give their analysis. But when you also give your analysis, you should also be objective. And that is, let's say you analyze a candidate. You might say Trump or Kamala gave a good speech. They were charismatic. They were energetic. You might hate Trump. You might hate Kamala. But you still have to objectively say that person was energetic. That person was charismatic. So in my analysis, I'm going to give the guy a compliment, and I'm not going to take that back. Anyway, I guess I won't see you guys for a little bit, probably a week and change, but I will see you later then, and thank you all for watching. Au revoir.